It's my privilege today to talk to Theo Boshoff, CEO of the Agricultural Business Chamber. Theo, welcome.
Thank you.
Looking back at 2024 and to 2025 ahead, have we made progress in implementing ESG, and do we have sustainable practices in place across the agricultural sector and its value chains?
It's an interesting one because sustainability, do we have sustainable practices in place? Certainly we do, definitely. I think the industry, driven out of need for electricity crises, water shortages that we have in the country, certainly those things have been put in place and are being implemented. ESG, whilst it's linked to sustainability, it's a bit more the reporting side of it. So it's the lens through which sustainability is often judged by the value chain or stakeholders. And I think that missing middle that we are trying to bridge at the moment with various projects and working with stakeholders in the industry is to ensure that the sustainability practices that are being put in place are accurately reported and are packaged in a manner that it can be reported, so that the industry actually gets recognition for everything that is being done. So essentially it's just about building that roadmap. Of course, clients and stakeholders might want reports to take place in a certain manner, on reporting on carbon emissions, reporting on energy consumption, etc. So really our role is just to put that roadmap in place in terms of how one can do it.
Theo, of course, in the same kind of theme as ESG and sustainability, also the EU's green trade barriers. How will they impact South Africa's agricultural export market? And do we have plans in place to mitigate a possible negative impact?
It's a very contentious one, and you see it definitely, this divide between sort of the global north as well as the global south in terms of how sustainability practices should be reported and what should get measured. So as we mentioned, sustainability has to be risk-based, and the risks that countries in the global north and companies in the global south face might be slightly different. And the basic concept of sustainability is always that you try to address the risk that you face. Now, where some of these so-called green trade barriers come from, will come in the form of carbon border tariff adjustments. So essentially, if carbon tax is less in the country of origin than it is in the importing country, so in this instance the UK or the EU, then there's adjustments that can be made largely to protect their own industries. So the overall intention, I think, is sound. You don't want a situation where a certain trade bloc is committed to sustainability and especially environmental sustainability. However, other countries, other companies can bypass that. But the manner in which it's done, I think, is the key, and that's why it's sometimes seen as sort of trade barriers. Exactly in line with the ESG discussion we had, there are certain areas where South African companies, for instance, water use, world leaders in terms of water use. But as long as we get our power, or majority of our power, from Eskom, and that's coal powered, in terms of our emissions footprint will always be higher than countries that are further along this just transition. So I think these are some of the challenges that we face to try to get a sense of realism in this, because at the moment the reason it's being termed sort of a trade barrier is it really is an all or nothing approach. It's if you want to play in this market, this is what you need to comply with, and if you don't want to comply with that, we will put additional tariffs on that. So what is being done to try to mitigate that is, on the one side, obviously to shift the narrative a little bit and to get recognition for where developing countries are in this space. In the climate change framework, you have what's called a common objective but differentiated responsibilities between developed and developing countries. But there's still quite a bit of sticking points in terms of bringing in that same principle when it comes to trade and how the green elements of trade are brought in. So it's a lively debate. On the one side, we have to try to, on the South African side, and other emerging market economies are exactly the same, decarbonize, adopt sustainable practices as fast as possible, and that obviously will have a net good for the environment as well. But on the other side, there are debates taking place at the WTO level, and we're also trying to input into those debates just to get evidence-based data to try to shift the narrative a little bit. Not to say that we need to assume less responsibility, but it's just give recognition that there are differentiating circumstances and different risks faced by countries, that you don't treat everyone exactly the same.
Is this picture going to be sort of an unintentional catalyst, do you think, for increased trade between African countries?
It could well be. Trade between African countries, and at the moment there's so much focus on the African continental free trade area, and I think it's largely positive, but there are other challenges as well hindering it. So certainly as one market becomes more challenging, for instance, the EU or the UK, I wouldn't say it's closing, but it's becoming more challenging, and the barriers to entry are higher, one has to look at diversifying in other markets, and Africa is one of them. There are still challenges around logistics, around cross-border payment platforms. These are really the things that we need to try to overcome. So the first phase of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is to reach agreement on sufficient tariff lines that it's essentially a common market. But the second phase, about aligning competition policy, aligning intellectual property rights, that regulatory elements aligning it across border, because that's really what facilitates trade, as well as obviously your physical logistical barriers. That's really where the work still needs to be done.
So South Africa is taking over chairmanship of the G20 in 2025. How do you see our role in this forum changing in the coming year or years, as well as in the B20?
So G20, obviously it's the 19 biggest economies plus the African Union. And by definition, you'll only get a chance again 20 years from now. So it really is such a small window period to have that impact, to make sure that the voice of Africa and the global South is heard in all the issues that get discussed at the G20. Now, the G20, of course, being the government level, there are a multitude of issues there around international security and geopolitical situation that gets discussed. But the shadow organization behind that, the B20, which is essentially the business chambers of all these, these 20 economies or economic blocks, that's where we play quite a big role. And essentially what the B20's purpose is to come up with concrete policy recommendations, which is more complicated than it sounds, because you need those 20 economies, some of them emerging markets, some of them highly developed economies, to agree on common policy positions, and that can then be tabled to the G20, to the governments to be adopted. So if you look at just in terms of trade statistics, the G20 accounts for about 80% of the world's trade and about 75% of the world's GDP. So if you can reach alignment on policy positions there, it's a tremendous opportunity. So it's certainly something one has to take up. And exactly the discussions around sustainability and potentially green trade barriers, these are things that can be raised at the G20, and things which Brazil, the country that in 2024 chaired it, have already raised. So there's a really solid platform for us to build on. If you think about the simple element of 60% of the world's underutilized agricultural land is in Africa. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's the implication there with converting that to agricultural land. There's carbon emissions, there's deforestation. So it's really about trying to find that balance. And I think that is really where the contentious areas will be within the G20 and B20 discussions. But we have this opportunity to take it on. Being the host, obviously you always have got slightly more opportunity to get some of your issues across. So that's what we'll aim to do. But as I mentioned, we also need to build on the work that Brazil has done. After South Africa in 2025, it moves back to the United States, and it will probably stay in the global north for quite a while. So we've got this limited window period to really influence the policy alignment amongst emerging market and developed countries. So it's an opportunity we have to take with both hands.
Theo, in the past we've seen major logistical challenges, and it seems that the private sector and the government rallied together to make some tangible changes. But what is the progress that has been made so far?
So with logistics, unfortunately, because it's so complicated and it differs so much between rail and as well as ports, it's often a case of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But as long as we're moving in the right direction, I think it's very positive. So some of the changes that have taken place on the institutional side, and especially in rail, which is busy taking place, are quite fundamental. I mean, we're moving from a position of a state-owned enterprise that has a monopoly on all rail transport, infrastructure, management, etc., towards a regulated open access system. So where the state still owns the infrastructure, of course, the Transnet infrastructure manager would maintain the infrastructure, but essentially opening it up to Transnet as well as any third-party private sector operator to be able to use the national railway network. So it's a fundamental change. It's a journey, though, I think definitely, and we're still at the early parts of the journey, but the intention is very, very clear. And some of the recent developments around speaking about the network statement that will outline the tariffs, the access conditions, how you book slots, etc., how you ensure fair competition if it's going to be open up to private sector. It's the beginning parts of the journey, but it really is very positive long term that South Africa is now catching up with a model which has proven to be so successful internationally. Of course, there is always the alternative to rail, even though it's more expensive and potentially less green, but you can still move by road infrastructure. But for exports and imports, there's simply no alternative to the ports. And that's why our focus, as well as the focus of the National Logistics Crisis Committee, has very much been on improving the efficiency, improving the performance of our ports. Now, there's a number of elements there. I think a big management changes has taken place in collaboration with private sector, contracted capacity and consultants, and Transnet itself to improve some of the business processes and practices and communication back up into the value chain. I think the management has certainly improved a lot. The equipment side of it is still a challenge. There's been historical underinvestment in especially port equipment. And one of the quickest wins in terms of getting that investment that we need is, of course, private sector participation, bringing in partners from the private sector. Now, that is the classical example of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Durban Pier 2, that handles about 60% of South Africa's container cargo, that went on tender for private sector party. It's now gone into litigation, and unfortunately that's been interdicted. So the timelines have likely been pushed out by probably about a year and a half. But we're still very much convinced that in principle it's the right way to go. So whilst the legal process needs to run its course, there's very much still a focus on bringing private sector capital for the new equipment, as well as obviously taking over some of the work that's now been done jointly between business and private sector for the new management team at Transnet to take those business processes forward to improve efficiency.
Unfortunately, you just can't avoid those teething phases in this journey ahead.
Absolutely.
Theo, there seems to be really good continuity in the implementation of the AMP into 2025. But what are some of those major action points that not only the GNU, but various role players and stakeholders in the sector are going to be focusing on?
I think, as you mentioned, the first positive thing is that there's still commitment to the same plan. There's always a temptation when there's a new administration, out with the old, in with the new, we write a new plan. But the Agriculture and Agro-Processing Master Plan really was evidence-based, and I think it's still the best plan we have. The challenge of it is simply the complexity. There is 137 initiatives or outcomes in total, which is a huge amount. Some of those rely on private sector. Most of it rely on participation or collaboration between private sector and government. And there's a number of those that fall within the policy space of the Department of Agriculture, Rural Development and Land Reform. And those are seeing some progress. I think there's good collaboration between private sector and the department there. And there's definitely that commitment to get that done. But the challenge is agriculture doesn't just rely on one regulator or one department. If you look at some of the big systemic interventions that we need to have inclusive growth in the sector, job creation in the sector, it would be making more water available, for instance, for more plantings, more hectares, more labour can be absorbed as well. But that requires interventions by Department of Water and Sanitation, likewise with Department of Employment and Labour, and the list goes on, Environmental Affairs. There's quite a few that it's actually a whole government approach which is required. And if you start breaking down the complexity, it can't simply be one lead department implementing it. And I think that's been the biggest challenge. Is it's been seen as an agricultural plan, which it is, but it doesn't simply rely on the Department of Agriculture. So the recent interventions by the National Planning Commission to help mainstream all of the master plans, including the Agricultural Master Plan, in the medium-term performance targets for all the government departments is an absolutely vital intervention. If I just, the simple example, and it sounds simple, but it's actually incredibly complicated to get right. But for our export-orientated industry, which employs the most labor, which also brings in foreign earnings, we need to diversify markets, as we mentioned. And outside of our traditional markets or the African continent, we often get priced out of the market when we export to several Asian countries, for instance, because we don't have free trade agreements where Australia, New Zealand, South America might have free trade agreements with them. Now that requires a very coordinated approach from the DTIC, from the Department of International Relations, and to get that going is quite a complicated and quite a big task. And that's really where you need cabinet intervention, because there might be trade-offs with other industries. You have to look obviously on a country-by-country, case-by-case basis. We can identify the potential benefits for agriculture, but what are the trade-offs for a manufacturing sector, for instance? So I do say this with respect, but I think the AMP is largely a set of outcomes or almost a wish list from the agricultural sector. The difficult work now is to go through that and to see which ones are implementable, what are the trade-offs with other sector, and then actually to get champions, both from government as well as private sector, to go and say, I'll take responsibility, not responsibility for implementing it because it's not, it requires so many parties to do, but really just I will champion this cause in all the platforms that I have to see if we can get progress on the master plan. So I do think there's a renewed vigor and a renewed focus to implement the master plan, which is certainly very positive. But it's a journey. It's not a case of making one or two policy or legal changes and we've implemented it. It really is a journey that we have to follow.
And we look forward to the journey in 2025. Thank you so much, Theo, for talking to us.
Thanks for the opportunity.